you can look into the scientific research and they call it male feminization. Whenever you're adding all these chemicals, atrazine is the big one that's often studied. It's a herbicide. It's the second most used herbicide in North America. I don't know if you've heard of atrazine.
Mm-hmm. It's in the Midwest everywhere, right?
Yeah, it's in the drinking water. Totally illegal in Europe, by the way. They don't even allow it in Europe.
It's crazy.
And in America, it's the second most used after glyphosate. But they'll call it male feminization. You give these animals atrazine exposures, and they're equal exposures to a lot of Americans. And like, for example, if you have a frog and you've got him in 200 nanograms per deciliter of atrazine, 200, that male frog turns female. Now you've got a female frog. And this is when Alex Jones came out and said the frogs are gay and all that kind of stuff. They're not gay, they're turning a male into a female. And in America, the legal safety limit for atrazine in our drinking water, well, you guess, what do you think it is? I'm sure you don't know off the top of your head.
I don't know, probably close to the amount that was feminizing the frog?
It's 3,000.
Holy crap.
So 200 takes a male frog and turns a female. How much is allowed in our drinking water? 3,000. Now, we're not sitting in it all day long like that frog was and absorbing through our skin, but still, like, the point is made. That seems ridiculous, especially considering 0 is allowed in the drinking water in Europe.
Hey friends, welcome back. We're with Dr. Anthony J here. We're going to talk all about hormones and endocrine disrupting chemicals because Anthony did research at Mayo Clinic. You studied stem cells, but in your PhD research, you studied hormones and endocrinology. You wrote the book, it's Estrogeneration?
Yeah, right.
Okay.
Yep.
A huge point of emphasis for a lot of people because we know that fertility rates are going down. We know that the average male testosterone, compared to like 50 years ago is way low. Yep. So let's just talk big picture, then get into the nuances of tactics, what we can do with filtered water, avoiding plastics, BPA in the receipts. How is it that these persistent organic pollutants, these endocrine disrupting chemicals are screwing up our hormone levels? Like what's going on physiologically?
Yeah, good point. I mean, well, first of all, even if we didn't understand exactly how they're bringing down testosterone, they're bringing down testosterone, right? In the 1980s, the average male was 500 on their total testosterone. You can look up the Massachusetts aging study, it's called. Mm-hmm. In the 90s, the average male was about 425 or something. It's basically 400. And then in the 2000s, it was about 300. I mean, it's dropping like a percentage point every year, right? It's dropping down like crazy. And now we're seeing people at 250 all the time, and they're normalizing it, right? Like look at the blood tests, and they're saying normal testosterone for men, 250 to 1,000. Well, that used to be 500 to 1,500. And our paleo ancestors, we have data on paleo ancestors from the bone records and things. Mm-hmm. They were literally like walking around at 1,500. Wow. Just like a normal male. Mm-hmm. So that is a problem, including like breast cancer rates going way up, right? I mean, then in the last 20, 30 years, breast cancer has exploded 250%. And again, so just looking at the actual epidemiology and looking at population studies, we have an obvious problem, but specifically, if you're just talking about testosterone, which is important for women and men, by the way, these fake estrogen chemicals, they imitate estrogen, right? But they don't just mess with your estrogen and progesterone ratios. They block the testosterone binding to the receptor. They lower your total testosterone and they lower your free testosterone. 3 things. And the blocking, the binding is almost the worst one, right? Because the analogy I like to use is a hockey goal. Like, because I'm from Minnesota, imagine you're playing hockey and you put a plywood board in front of your goal. It doesn't matter how many players you have on the ice and how many pucks you're shooting at the goal. You're not scoring any goals if you've got blockage, right, in front of that net. And the same thing is true with these hormones. It doesn't really matter if your total testosterone is 1,500 if you're blocking the receptor really badly. And these estrogen chemicals do that. Differing degrees for different chemicals. There's a whole list of them, like oxybenzone and sunscreen. There's parabens, which like methylparaben, propylparaben, butylparaben. There's a lot of different parabens. There's a lot of different phthalates. There's a lot of bisphenols, BPA. Everybody's heard of BPA, right? But there's BPA, there's BPF, there's BPS, there's BPAF. There's a whole alphabet of those things. And if you make one illegal, the companies just shift and they make BPF. And the problem is that's as bad, if not worse. And you can read the scientific literature. It says it's as bad, if not worse, in terms of the estrogenic activity.
Can we pause there? Because the Nalgene bottles, everyone was like, okay, I'm going to get rid of my BPA-containing Nalgene bottle. Yeah. But then now maybe they contain BPF.
Oh yeah, they sure do.
This is insane. So
Yeah.
he's like, you can't get away from it.
If you look on the bottom of the bottle and it has a little recycling symbol and the number is 7 on that symbol, that's a bisphenol. That's in that category. And if it says BPA free and it's got a little 7, that's bisphenol S usually. Usually it's S, yeah.
Wow.
And S is worse than BPA.
This is so, we're like robbing
That's the
Peter to
sad
pay
thing.
Paul. Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow, this is crazy. So I love that analogy, right? Because there's people who will go on hormone replacement therapy because they go to the doctor, testosterone is low, free is low, total is low, and free is low. They have the symptoms. So the doctor's like, okay, you know, Hank, you need to get on testosterone. They get on testosterone and they're aromatizing into estrogen, they're getting man boobs and they're actually gaining belly fat and they don't feel any better. And you're like, what the hell is going on? And part of that probably is like what you're saying is like there's so much of this persistent organic pollutants, EDCs, endocrine disrupting chemicals, wedging that receptor and preventing that.
And if you didn't solve the root cause of the problem, I mean, the root cause, right, is important because let's say your testosterone is low because of heavy metals. Well, if you don't remove the heavy metals and you just start taking testosterone on top of that, well, now you've got mercury problems and your mental disorders and all kinds of whatever heavy metal you're exposed to, cobalt, chromium, cadmium, whatever. If that was the root cause of lowering testosterone, you better damn sure address that before you worry about taking testosterone. And the same is true of plastics and personal care products and sunscreen chemicals. If you're exposing yourself to all these chemicals and you haven't addressed that and you're just throwing testosterone cream on top of that, yeah, it's exactly the problem, right? It's not going to solve the problem. And I'm very favorable for testosterone replacement if you need it, if you've actually cleaned up the root cause of these issues, but the root cause is important.
Hey friends, welcome back. So today's show is brought to you by Myoscience Nutrition. As you can tell, we're talking a lot about ways to minimize exposure to persistent organic pollutants and endocrine disrupting chemicals that can be harmful for your health. One tool that I frequently recommend to clients, especially if they go out to dinner or if they travel or if they have a high occupational exposure to some of the aforementioned compounds that we're talking about today, you might want to consider supplementing with the amino acids known as N-acetylcysteine and glycine. These two amino acids are part of the glutathione tripeptide that, as you know by now, is very involved and intimately connected to the processes of detoxification. It also functions as an antioxidant in the body. So the Myoscience NAC Glycine Supreme, it's a powder because you want to make sure you're getting therapeutic levels of the NAC and also the glycine. Many encapsulated products simply don't offer the dose that you need that's been shown to support the natural healthy production of glutathione from a dietary supplement standpoint. But the Myoscience NAC Glycine Supreme also offers taurine, which is a sulfur-containing amino acid that has many health properties in the body. So I would encourage you to consider this, especially if you have a high occupational exposure, or if you recreationally drink alcohol, or if you travel, or things like that. You might want to take one serving in the evening time before bed. Many people don't realize this, but antioxidants and taking antioxidants actually function better in the body when you take them away from the daytime because our resting metabolic rate and metabolism is quite high. So I suggest taking this in the evening time prior to sleep. Also, glycine has properties related to supporting the healthy production of GABA in the brain, which might aid in sleep and so forth. So you can save on this over at myoscience.com. That's MYOXCIENCE.com. And be sure to use the code podcast at checkout. That's podcast over at myoscience.com, and I'll put links below to the NAC Glycine Supreme. So let's cut back to it with Dr. Anthony J.
And I want to get to that everything else in a little bit, but you mentioned parabens, you mentioned phthalates. Actually, we didn't talk about phthalates. You mentioned bisphenol A.
I mentioned it, yeah.
Yeah. Phthalates, what are the top sources? So, you know, we have like stainless steel water bottles. I recommend clients and everyone drink out of glass.
Yeah.
What's the other source of exposure?
Yeah, well, with the drinking water, I mean, just think about the plastic piping that's piping the water in everywhere now. People are moving from copper to PEX. PEX is plastic, you know, it has phthalates. And those phthalates leach in there. So I think one of the big exposures that people have is just they got to filter their drinking water. It's coming into your house. You got to have a filter, you know, and don't store it in plastic. Yeah, sure, if you have to, right? Some people have to for whatever reason. Like if you're going to the airport and you just got to get some bottled water really quick. I mean, obviously, it's better than being dehydrated once in a while. But day-to-day exposures are terrible. If you're just constantly being exposed to these chemicals, that's a bigger problem, obviously. So you're correct. I mean, use stainless steel. I like those little water filters, or those ones on the sink. You attach it to the sink and then you flip it up and down. You've seen those?
Yep.
Because you're not storing in anything. You're just flipping it up, filtering your water into a cup. You drink it, you flip it back down. But if for some reason you have a plastic Brita pitcher You can filter into that. It's not as good as having something without plastic, but you can filter into that and then dump that into a glass pitcher and store that in your fridge, right? If you've already gotten it. Those all have activated charcoal, and activated charcoal is the key to getting these estrogen chemicals out. Like I've published peer-reviewed scientific research using activated charcoal to pull estrogen chemicals out of things. It works, it's phenomenal. Sometimes they call it carbon, which is a bit of a misnomer, but it's activated charcoal. And those filters, if it's got it, you're good.
So that's binding up. So would you put that, say, in the bottom of the glass bottle or in the the Brita bottle?
In the filter. No, it's actually built into the filter.
Okay.
Yeah,
So
you
it's
don't have to
filtering.
take activated pills. You don't have to do anything. You don't have to put any in your water. It's in the filter. It's part of the filter.
That's key. And then what about food and then food packaging? What are the big things that are, you mentioned sunscreen is a source of some of these compounds. But food packaging in particular, I think, is problematic,
A lot
right?
of plastics, yeah. In fact, the vegans like Michael Greger and whatnot, hope you don't mind me name dropping them, but basically, a lot of these vegans, they'll tell you, and this is true, you don't want to eat chicken because it's full of phthalates. And you look at the studies and it's like, wow, how is there so much phthalates? And if you watch them while they're preparing those chicken breasts, they're injecting them. You can see these big needles they have. They pump them full of this liquid stuff, and then they get the next one, pump it full, and you watch them plump up the chicken breasts. Well, what's in that liquid that they're putting in there? Well, number one, some salt and some other stuff, but they're putting phthalates directly in some of these products, which is really pathetic, right? Because people are trying to eat healthy, and the last thing they need is more phthalates. And the part of the reason is it's a preservative. I mean, you can see it on the label. If you go to the grocery store and you look up corn tortillas, some of them will have parabens. It'll say methylparaben, propylparaben, butylparaben. I used to bring them as props when I was doing consulting for like hockey teams or something, for like the NFL. I would bring a thing of the parabens and I would like throw them down, like look at the label. You don't think these things are in your food. So, number one, you don't want them to be directly in your label. If they're listed on the label, it's in the food. But the other thing is liquids. So if you have liquids in plastics, you're going to get leaching, especially if it's heated up. But even at room temperature, I've looked at the amount of leaching that occurs from the parabens and the phthalates and these chemicals that are plastic. So if it's a solid, like say you have a hamburger patty and you got some plastic touching it, not that big of a deal. Let's be real. I mean, there's probably a tiny bit of leaching. I wouldn't get too caught up on that. But if you've got a soup and it's in a plastic jar, I'm staying away from that generally. Like I say, once in a while, super rare exception, sure, But to be doing that every day, I talk to people sometimes that do these TV dinners and stuff, and they pay a lot of money for these extra fancy ones, and they're putting them in the microwave and heating them up, and it's all liquid and it's all plastic. It's that black plastic. That black plastic comes from recycled electrical gear, like electronic cords and stuff.
Goodness gracious, man.
It has nothing to do with like food safety, and when they're making that stuff, all they care about is electrical properties, and all the chemicals they're putting in there is geared to that. It's a next level up for dangerous, like chemical exposures.
Well, and probably even metals too. I mean, like electronics have
a lot of copper.
Wow, that's
a lot
insane.
Of aluminum.
Intuitively,
Which bioaccumulates, builds up.
Yeah, I would have thought the black plastic, because it's a little more dense, I would have thought that would have been safer. Just my intuition, but I'm way off. That is insane.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Holy smokes, man. This stuff is ever. So, I mean, if you eat junk food, you're staying up late, your blood sugar's a wreck. I mean, you're putting on, you can just see how these people are not, and why they have blood sugar issues. Part of that is low testosterone links to poor metabolic health and cardiovascular disease, depression. No wonder we have a mental health crisis. I mean, this is insane.
Exactly. And that's the problem with our medical system. I mean, that's one of the things I was talking about today on my talk is, look, the system is basically set up as a pharmaceutical, like these doctors are trained as pharma reps. Right? I hate to say it, but basically that's how they train them. I mean, if you go to California, over to New York, down to Florida, they say the exact same thing. Oh, your cholesterol's too high. We need to get you on some statins. And if you look at the data for the numbers, it's like my cholesterol's not actually too high. And that's true of all this stuff. Like, the gut, people have all these gut issues and they want to put you on Prozac and Zoloft and Lexapro. Well, you don't have a Prozac deficiency. I guarantee it, because Prozac is not a necessary nutrient. Nobody has a Prozac deficiency. They have something else going on that's not being addressed. And the same is true with these estrogens, like the low testosterone, right? If you get people on low testosterone and then instead of replacing the testosterone or fixing the root cause problem, now they need 5 prescription drugs. Well, that's a financial boom. You see, so there's not a lot of incentive. It's almost opposite of incentive. It's opposite. It is opposite. So they're making money on people having low testosterone. And I'll tell you a story, Mike. when I was working in Boston, doing research with actual testosterone, the hormone, when you buy it in these little glass vials, I had to get signatures to get it, to buy it from like department chairs. And then when it came in the mail, I had to get signatures. And I had to put it in a locked safe, like a gun safe, you're like getting your testosterone out in the morning. And then when you measure out a little bit, like a few milligrams, you have to do the math and say like, I took this much out and get signatures. Well, down the hall from me, there was a scientist, PhD scientist. His name is Robert Ferrante. True story, you can look him up. He's in prison. He murdered his wife. His wife was a medical doctor. He put cyanide in her protein shake.
Oh my God.
And she went to the gym and had a heart attack. And he tried to get her rush cremated. And then the nurse said, like, the blood is a little weird red color. Let's check for cyanide, which they would never do. For some reason, this heroic nurse, just like nailed it because her cyanide was off the charts. And like I said, now he's in prison. But the reason I bring this up is because I was studying testosterone and they were treating me like I was doing uranium research on a nuclear bomb. And he's down the hall. He ordered 1 kilogram of cyanide and nobody cared. And there was a big chunk of it missing, right? Because, of course, after they caught him, they dug into all of his stuff and, like, what's going on? Where did he get the cyanide? He just ordered cyanide.
That is so preposterous.
And that a lot of that's pharmaceutical, meaning they don't want you to research. They want to at least make it annoying to research testosterone because testosterone protects your arteries against plaque, right? It protects your brain against Alzheimer's. It protects your metabolism. So your blood sugar goes down, which improves pretty much everything, right? So now you don't have the chronic fatigue, you don't have the mental disorders. I mean, on and on and on. And so if you're studying that and you're finding that out and you're helping people raise their testosterone in any different myriad of ways, that's a problem for the pharmaceutical companies. So, people need to be thinking for themselves because it's not just one person. It's not like a person in pharma is a real problem. He's really unethical. It's just the way the system is set up.
Yep.
It's a money-driven machine. And, again, it's not one person, but the way the machine is set up is not optimizing for your health or my health or whoever's. It's optimizing for selling more drugs.
Mm-hmm. Keeping people unhealthy. I mean, this is absurd.
And testosterone, sorry to cut you off.
No, you can,
I talk too much often.
It's good.
But testosterone is a very, like go and get 'em type of a hormone. It's very, I don't want to say aggressive, but it's like, it's an action hormone, right? It's not a passive hormone. It's not going to make you, it's not going to make you apathetic. In fact, in animal studies, if you block testosterone, it makes them apathetic. You can reverse, like sexual drive and just motivation and drive to do things. Like you can put rats on treadmills and they determine how much they want to go on the treadmill. And you cut their testosterone and now they want to go on the treadmill less. They want to exercise less. Mm-hmm. Like I said, sex drive goes down, like all kinds of things. And so again, if you want more motivation in your career, you want higher testosterone, right? Men and women. Women, it's super important too. And we can talk about that later or whenever if you want, like the normal ranges for women and fitting that in. But
I think it's all fascinating, but just to talk about estrogen a little bit in the brain, it's interesting how estrogen can increase aggression in the brain as well. There's Andrew Huberman has done a deep dive into some of this, and that was new research to me, understanding how if you stimulate this one receptor via estrogen, that it really enhances like violent behavior in animals and rodents and things like that. But so I think testosterone is misunderstood. Like if in some senses, like, oh, it's bad, it makes you super aggressive, but part of that could be estrogen as well.
I always say it's a delicate balance between the two. Mm-hmm. People get caught up with just one or the other, but both of them are great. Natural estrogen is phenomenally protective against Alzheimer's and heart attacks and depression and all this other stuff too, but you start throwing that delicate balance off between the hormones. And in a lot of studies, it's very counterintuitive because if you start decreasing the natural estrogen levels in women and you start throwing in these fake estrogen chemicals, you androgize the women. You make them more masculine. So it's almost like a gender neutralization. It sounds weird, but you can look into the scientific research and they call it male feminization. Whenever you're adding all these chemicals, atrazine is the big one that's often studied. It's a herbicide. It's the second most used herbicide in North America. I don't know if you've heard of atrazine.
Mm-hmm. It's in the Midwest everywhere, right?
Yeah, it's in the drinking water. Totally illegal in Europe, by the way. They don't even allow it in Europe.
It's crazy.
And in America, it's the second most used after glyphosate. But they'll call it male feminization. You give these animals atrazine exposures, and they're equal exposures to a lot of Americans. And like, for example, if you have a frog and you've got him in 200 nanograms per deciliter of atrazine, 200, that male frog turns female. Now you've got a female frog. And this is when Alex Jones came out and said the frogs are gay and all that kind of stuff. They're not gay. They're turning a male into a female. And in America, the legal safety limit for atrazine in our drinking water, well, you guess. What do you think it is? I'm sure you don't know off the top of your head.
I don't know. Probably close to the amount that was feminizing the frog.
It's 3,000.
Holy crap.
So 200 takes a male frog and turns a female. How much is allowed in our drinking water? 3,000. Now, we're not sitting in it all day long like that frog was and absorbing through our skin, but still, like, the point is made. That seems ridiculous, especially considering 0 is allowed in the drinking water in Europe, right? Like, meaning it's not a safe chemical, and we're exposing ourselves like crazy. But it's not just atrazine, because now you got the plastic water bottles. Oh, and you got all this fragrance with all these parabens. You're rubbing it on your skin. Your skin is absorbing all this stuff. Oh, and now you've got like sunscreen chemicals, right? We haven't even talked about that, but oxybenzone in sunscreen, by far the most widely used chemical in sunscreen. That's an estrogen endocrine disruptor. It acts like estrogen in your body. And they did a study, after I published my book, they did a study with oxybenzone, and one application of sunscreen, just one. 7 days later, it was above the government's safety limits in people's blood. And that's just an adult with one application of oxybenzone. And some people are putting it on their kids like 5 days a week, and like putting it on their face with these like personal care products that brag about like keeping your face protected from the sun. Some people put it in their hair with these like hair products that are bragging about how it protects your hair from being frayed and all this stuff from UV damage. It's in the cars too. If you smell that new car smell, that's usually oxybenzone. And by the way, we're kind of attracted to that smell, right? Like you go in there and like, oh, this is good. It's a hormone. I mean, it's basically perverting your brain into thinking like, oh, this is a pheromone, or this is an estrogen, or this is some type of an attractive chemical. It's not. But your brain is perceiving it that way. That's why you like the new car smell. Roll the windows down when you first start driving and flush that out of there, because it's really concentrated initially if it's a hot day. And, things like that. Like, think about these things, because most people, it's not even on their radar.
Right.
And if it is, they're saying like, well, it's okay because scientists know what's best and scientists say it's okay. And that's bullshit, because we're being exposed to a number of them. So nobody's studying the additive effects of them, the 1 + 1 + 1 + 1 + 1, eventually getting to 10. And nobody's studying the bioaccumulation, meaning like they're storing up in your body, which has a longer term impact. And then nobody's studying the actual long-term impacts, right? They're doing 6-week studies and saying, oh, look, you're okay.
Right. And it's that old school toxicology model where the dose makes the poison, right?
Yeah.
Which that couldn't be further from the truth, because we're talking about these are in picogram or nanogram parts per trillion in the body, but they don't bind to the same sex hormone binding globulin or albumin. They're floating free, unlike our own endogenous hormones. So the pharmacokinetics are non-linear, and that's what people don't understand. Yeah. It's not the dose makes the poison.
Well, I'm glad you brought it up, because 100% agree, number one. But number two, even if it was the case, the problem is these chemicals like BPA, oftentimes you hear this from scientists, they'll say, oh, BPA is okay because it takes kilograms before it'll kill you, right? The toxicity is super high. It takes a lot before it's going to kill you. Well, yeah, because it acts like estrogen. Your body thinks of it as estrogen. So when you're exposed to BPA, your body's like, oh, this is cool. It's just an estrogen. So when you have cells growing in a dish, and by the way, they're plastic dishes. So what you do is, if I took out some of your cells, and I've seen this, because I've worked with cells, right? I studied at Mayo Clinic, like you said in the intro, and I've done stem cells and dishes and all this stuff. You take them out, you put them in a dish, 80% of those cells die because it's freaking plastic. And the dose is too high for them, but the ones that happen to be resistant against all that plastic chemicals, they survive. So then you're studying cells that are already kind of robust against the plastics. But let's say that wasn't a problem, which it is, but let's pretend that it's not a problem. You've got cells in a dish and you put a bunch of BPA in there, right? And the cells don't die. Well, that's because they just think you're adding more estrogen. So, you're influencing the way the cells behave, but you're not killing the cell. So it's not toxic. So yeah, the toxicity is kind of low and it's not toxic, but it doesn't mean it's safe.
Right. Oh man.
So there's a lot of facets, right?
It's amazing. But talking about the practicality aspect of it, you mentioned the new car. It made me think of like, okay, if you get an Uber or a Lyft, oftentimes they're running multiple air fresheners in there. Do the air fresheners emit any of these persistent organic endocrine disruptors?
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah, Mike, it's everywhere.
So we're getting
Don't get the fragrances. I'm telling you, if you see the word fragrance on a label, just don't buy it. Whether it's a soap or whether it's a shampoo or whatever. I mean, go fragrance free. Unless you know the company and you trust what they're putting in there. They're using these petroleum-based, dirt cheap chemicals that they can buy in the truckloads. They can buy kilograms of this stuff for like pennies. It's ridiculous. Coming from China. And by the way, China has stricter regulations than America on parabens and phthalates. And they're having a big push right now in China, trying to masculinize the men. You know, they're like firing people that are feminine in the newscasting. You've heard this, right?
Yeah.
It's kind of funny and strange, but they're cracking down on a lot of these chemicals. And in America, the problem is our system is so financially driven. Like the politicians are funded by these pharma companies and these giant corporations that are making all these chemicals and whatnot. These, you know, so we don't end up outlawing these chemicals when we should. There's a friend of mine named Michael Skinner. He's out in Washington, close to where you are. He does rat studies. Like he literally has like 5,000 rats at any given time, or mice, you know, mice and rats. I mean, which is crazy, the overhead cost for this. And he does epigenetic research. So he follows these things out in multiple generations. He'll do one exposure to one of these estrogen chemicals and find 4 generations later there's impacts. There's epigenetic impacts. Because you can do 3 generations, but the problem is if a pregnant rat, you know, is being exposed, well, then the fetus is already being exposed. So that's 2 generations. And the fetus has stem cells for their gonads. So they're being, you know, you've got 3 generations exposed in one exposure. But if you study the 4th generation and you see problems, health problems, 4 generations out from one exposure to the mother, well, that's a real problem. It's Michael Skinner. He's like super pessimistic about our country. And the reason I bring him up, though, and I'm less pessimistic, I think people can do something about this. I think you can get these things out of your life. Like I say, get rid of these fragrances, filter your drinking water. It's not that complicated. But use the sauna, sweat them out, right? You're going to get some exposure, sweat them out. But Michael Skinner, he went over to Europe and gave a talk on one of these chemicals. It's a fungicide. This was like 5 years ago. And 2 weeks later, Europe banned that chemical. 2 weeks. And in America, that was 5 years ago. That talk was 5 years ago. The chemical's still just as bad as it was. Still totally legal in America.
That's sad.
Yeah.
Well, speaking of which, and some viewers or listeners might deem this question controversial, but I think it's pertinent considering how many young women and young men identify as gender dysphoric or transgender. So we can't help but imagine, obviously we have the internet, we have more access to information, and confused kids, you know, finding with mental health issues, maybe thinking, well, my life might be happier because I more identify as a woman or whatever. But I happen to believe, and I don't have a lot of research to look at this, and I'm sure you've dove into that there could be a biochemical link here with the exposure epigenetically or trans epigenetic issues with regards to persistent organic pollutants and things that are augmenting hormones that are causing people to then feel off in their body.
Oh yeah, for sure.
What do you think?
No, I mean, scientists are getting more and more afraid to use the word male feminization, but in terms of these estrogen chemicals, that's exactly what they used to call it. And behind closed doors, they'll still tell you like, oh yeah, male feminization is a real thing. It happens. The more exposure you get to these chemicals, the more you see specifically male feminization. And again, like coming in the other direction, you see some of that as well with the female androgenization, if you want to call it that, or I don't know what a better term for that is, but yeah. I've talked to people, and especially with writing my book on this, I include a whole section about male feminization in my book. And I've had people that are trans and doing, you know, like going through gender therapy and all this, and they said like, look, I think you're right. Like I was exposed to a lot of these chemicals when I was a kid. I used to run through the mosquito sprayer that would like fog the streets or whatever and like play in the fog and all this stuff. And they're the first ones to admit, right? Like they know where some of this stuff has come from in their history. And you know, it's like anything else. Like, I mean, I still say avoid the chemicals at that point in your life. Like wherever you are in your journey, in your health journey, like stop putting these chemicals on your skin, stop ingesting them in your water, stop, because it's not just this male feminization. It's not just the breast cancer increase. It's not just whatever. There's too many other health risks associated with being exposed to these chemicals long term. Mm-hmm. I mean, they've done studies on polar bears in northern Alaska. Have you ever seen this?
I've read abstracts. I haven't dove into
them. Yeah, they tested 11 polar bears in northern Alaska. And all of them had parabens and phthalates in their fat cells and their kidneys and whatever. All the way up there, middle of nowhere, northern Alaska. It's because we've gotten so much in our food systems and in our drinking water. We're flushing it down our drains. It's circulating the oceans and the currents, and working up, you know, through the fish, the baby fish, the seals, the polar bears.
Wow.
It's a problem. And then they're becoming infertile. And we're blaming something like global warming on the polar bears becoming infertile. And nobody's talking about the parabens, right? It's just like the breast cancer. Yeah. All you hear about is the pink ribbons and saying, oh, we got to raise awareness for breast cancer. Well, who's actually looking at the parabens and the phthalates and the BPAs, the actual causes of breast cancer going up? Like we know those things cause breast cancer to increase. And it even causes depression to increase.
Yeah.
Like in children with higher levels of BPA in their urine, you see a lot more depression. In children, they shouldn't even have depression.
Right.
They're so resilient. So it's a really frustrating issue. But
And the link there with exposure to parabens and breast cancer, is that just hitting that estrogen receptor, just hammering it basically?
well, it's a little complicated, but since you're such a knowledgeable person on some of this, I'll lay it out a little bit deeper. There's two estrogen receptors, right? So with testosterone, there's only one. It's just the androgen receptor. So when testosterone's in your body, it binds the androgen receptor. Very simple. So I always like to say, oh, men are really simple and women are really complicated. Because women have three estrogens. There's estrone, there's estriol, there's estradiol. There's arguably a couple more, but we'll just talk about the main ones. So there's predominantly three estrogens, which is already more complicated than testosterone. But then there's two receptors that pick it up. There's estrogen receptor alpha and estrogen receptor beta. Alpha is the bad one. Now, it's not really bad. You need it. It's important for sexual development in the womb. But after the womb, you shouldn't be activating estrogen receptor alpha. It should be shut off. Beta, on the other hand, and by the way, alpha is linked to breast cancer. It's linked to prostate cancer in men. On and on and on. Prostate cancer is not a testosterone problem. It's an alpha problem. It's an estrogen receptor alpha. It's an estrogen problem. But the beta receptor, the other receptor for estrogen receptor beta, if you want to look it up on Wikipedia, it's called ESR2. That's the gene name for it. That's protective against breast cancer. It's protective against prostate cancer. It's literally protective against Alzheimer's, protective against heart disease. I mean, you pretty much name it and it's protective. It's good for you. And that's supposed to be activated throughout your life, right? You're supposed to be kind of activating that beta receptor with a little bit of estrogen, men and women. And, you know, the problem with these estrogen chemicals we're talking about is, guess which one they activate? Alpha receptor, right? So they're doing all the problems and basically shutting off the beta receptor, because if your body's saying, oh, we're getting all this alpha activation, what's it going to do for beta? It's going to turn down the taps, right? Wow. So if you're flipping on the wrong light switch and communicating to your body like, hey, you know, we need to do something different with these, it's going to just throw off all your hormones, you know what I mean? And that's exactly what you see. So
wow, that's really important stuff to know.
Well, and just to jump, sorry to cut you off, but this is the argument with soy, right? This is like the big hitter. We haven't even mentioned soy, and I feel like it's my fault because I'm thinking about all these plastics and stuff, but soy activates both receptors. And so some people, they genetically make more alpha or more beta or whatever, they can kind of get away with soy. And so you do these studies. And number one, the soy studies are a problem because you're researching people that are exposed to phthalates and BPA and whatever, and their body is just chock full of all these estrogens. And then you throw a little bit of soy in there for 6 weeks and you really think you're going to get breast cancer. Of course not. You're not going to increase anything if your system is already washed out in these estrogens. So that's the first thing. But the second thing is, it's complicated because some people do have higher risk of breast cancer with soy. Some people don't. It's because some people have more estrogen alpha receptors and some people don't. Just genetically, people are different. And so that's the real problem with soy, is that it's a risk. Every scientist agrees that it acts like estrogen. I mean, there's no debate about that. The debate is, is it a good or bad trigger, right? Is it a good estrogen or bad? This is the isoflavones in soy, the estrogens in soy. The debate tends to go in the direction of whether it's good or bad, like whether postmenopausal women should have it or not as a therapy or something. And I say no, because it activates both receptors. It's too risky. You don't want to be activating alpha. You're much better off with actual estrogen, actual progesterone to balance that off. But again, there's a lot of money there, so there's a lot of like muddying the waters with some of these. All it takes is one study that muddies the water, and then everybody gets caught up in saying, well, no, there's this one study that shows that it's actually really good for you, and there's 20 other ones that show it's bad. So I wanted to bring that up. Sorry to cut you off.
No, I think
it's important because most people don't realize, since we'd already laid all this groundwork out with alpha and beta, you got to throw soy in there.
100%. What about flax and the lignans in flax and that?
Lignans are good for you if your gut bacteria break them down. If they don't, it starts activating the alpha receptor, and I'm nervous about it. They did a study in Canada with over 100 food items, plant foods, all like broccoli, kale, cabbage, whatever, over 100 plants. And all of them were under 1,000 units of estrogen. So almost, and 1,000 sounds high, but it's not in this case, because soy and flax were the only exceptions. And soy was over 100,000, and so was flax.
Wow.
So 100,000 versus 1,000, a huge difference, right? So those act like estrogen. Basically, all the other plants don't, unless you're isolating compounds from them. Like licorice root, if you purify it and you take a lot of it, it starts acting like estrogen at a high dose, hundreds of thousands. And again, these are arbitrary units. I'm just calling them units for now instead of getting all caught up in the actual nanograms and all this. But Yeah, it's an estrogen, but your gut bacteria are very well adapted to breaking it down. And that's true of soy too, to some degree. If you have great gut bacteria, which is a huge assumption for most people, it's not true. But if you did, and I'm sure you do, and hopefully I do, but I actually don't. I have a pretty shitty gut. Like my guts, I struggle. That's one of my weak spots in my life, but it's better than it was, man. I used to have hemorrhoids. I used to have acid reflux, all this stuff. And I healed a lot of that. Like I don't have any of that anymore. And for me, it was mostly gluten. Gluten was the big trigger, and just grains in general. Got those out, healed my gut. But most Americans, I mean, their gut is a disaster. They're eating all these chemicals, all these processed foods, all this nonsense. And so you can't assume, like, let's give them soy and flax and their gut's going to manage that really well. So it's a big factor.
What about like fermented soy and tempeh? And these
all
things
good,
are a little bit better.
Those are 100% good.
Okay.
Those are fine. That same study I was telling you about with the soy and flax being over 100,000, they tested tempeh, they tested miso, they tested soy sauce that's actually fermented, and those are under 100 units of estrogen.
Wow.
So
Way
basically like less than broccoli. You know what I mean?
I mean, for certain people, you know, for vegans or vegetarians who want to get soy or whatever, that's definitely a better way to do it.
It's got vitamin K too. And fermentation, I mean, that's the same as, it's basically taking, instead of your gut doing it, you're doing it in a closed system, which is just, you know, with the microorganisms in there, breaking it down for you. It's a good system.
I like that. You mentioned menopause a little bit, but a lot of women, I more so than I remember as a child, like when my mother was going through menopause, but now women in their 30s are starting to hit menopause, and in their 40s, and they're struggling big time. I can't help but believe that this exposure, you know, hitting that ER alpha receptor or whatnot, is worsening the estrogen to progesterone ratios potentially. Can we talk about that?
Oh yeah, exactly right. I mean, and it's putting girls into puberty a lot younger as well. So they're coming into menopause earlier. I mean, in fact, they're trying to normalize puberty to a younger age. They're arguing in medical journals right now to try and lower it to age 9 because it's so common. Not to say that's bad, but they're not arguing and saying like, is it good or bad? They're just arguing and saying, let's try and make it normal, just like they did with vitamin D, right? They lower the range, just like they did with testosterone. They lower the range because everybody in our culture is getting so unhealthy. They're just trying to normalize that all. But don't be fooled. I mean, it's a problem. And again, you're right. I think it comes from a lot of these estrogen chemicals. I mean, what else could it come from? I can't even think of maybe nutrient deficiencies or something like that. But yeah, I mean, there's some research. There's not a lot of research on that specific question, but there's enough to indicate, that progesterone in particular is getting thrown off. And that's why these women are waking up at 3 a.m. and they can't get back to sleep, right? That's a classic low progesterone problem.
Right.
Postmenopause.
And then that early adrenarche is huge. And women are going through, you know, starting to develop breasts at age 9. I mean, this is insane. I have a daughter who's 10, and she's totally just an innocent little girl, but far from puberty. But her friends are getting breasts, and it's like, what?
And then they're getting pressured by males and all this stuff.
It's crazy.
They shouldn't be, because they're mentally not developed.
It's insane, and it's happening all around us as parents. We're seeing this, and I remember at 10. I mean, I wasn't thinking, you know, wasn't going through puberty, wasn't until 12, 13, something like that. But and so it's affecting their mental health because they're not, like you said, mentally prepared. They're getting breasts, they're getting attention from males, and this. It's like it's got to be a weird situation, and I feel bad for these young girls. But again, they're eating Chips Ahoy. Parents are feeding them mac and cheese, and they're drinking Coke, and they're on the iPhones at night. And it's like, well, it's no wonder that the hormones are out of whack, or that there's part of me suspects it's a metabolic health issue, and so there's some PCOS androgens going on. It's just this big hormonal disaster, essentially.
Well, you know, Michael Skinner on Washington University, same one I was talking about before with the talk over in Europe, and they made that chemical illegal. He studies PCOS. And if you want to give mice PCOS, you want to give that to rats, you give them atrazine, you give them BPA. Like he knows the doses and everything. He can nail it for you. If you want to make a mouse, a totally natural, healthy mouse with PCOS, to study PCOS, these are the chemicals. That's how they do it.
It's insane. And so the way that mainstream medicine is managing PCOS is with hormonal birth control. And metformin.
Exactly.
Like, we're not addressing the root cause, which is what I want to get to. You mentioned, look, we talked about avoidance, so we got to minimize our exposure, but then we need to get this crap out. What comes to mind is losing weight, going in the sauna, sweating. I wasn't aware, I know that the heavy metals, lead, cadmium, mercury, are a little bit easier to get out through the sweat, but also these persistent organic pollutants are...
Oh yeah, for sure. They have they call them BUS studies, right? Blood, urine, and sweat, BUS. And if you just Google BUS study phthalates.
Steven Genis, I think.
Oh yeah, there's a couple
Yeah.
of them, and yeah, he's done a few with BPA, right? And yeah, you're sweating them out. So they check people's urine, and there's not that much in there. There's not that much BPA. I mean, yeah, there's some. Almost everybody has some of these things. Not that much phthalates, and then you have those same people go in the sauna, and it's like chock full of their sweat. They test their sweat, and it's full of these estrogens. So that tells you it's a phenomenal tool for getting them off. As long as you go in the shower and kind of like wash that
Rinse
stuff
it.
off at some point. I mean, I'm a big fan of sauna cold, like, and I know you are too. You're especially into the cold therapy, and using that as a training modality for your vascular system, for your blood vessels to shrink tight and expand and shrink and expand. I mean, that's a training. It's a type of training. But the first time you get in that sauna and you start sweating, get in the shower and rinse that crap off before you start going cold, hot, cold, I think. You know?
Yeah, that's a good point.
Especially if you've not done it for years and years. I mean, like firefighters that use the sauna, I talk to them occasionally because they come to me and they say like, oh, I read your book and I totally agree with all this stuff. I went into this sauna, they'll tell me, and my sweat was black.
I've heard that.
Like they're wiping it off with a towel. I mean, yeah, you're sweating out some nasty stuff. And
Wow.
if you've never used a sauna and you're just starting, yeah, you better like take it a little more serious to wash that stuff off your skin after you get out of the sauna, you know.
That's such a good point. That is scary. What do you think about those foot baths, ionic foot baths? Because they do. I don't know. I've seen people do it. I don't know if there's any data showing that, but the water does get discolored. Do you think part of that is? Have you looked into that?
I don't know anything about it, no.
Some people swear by them. To be honest, I think they're a little quacky, but maybe they do something. I don't know. I mean, but it does turn the water like quite gnarly, and so it indicates potentially something. Either it's having a reaction with the fungus or
pH or
bacteria on your
something?
feet,
Oh,
right?
yeah? Okay.
Or there's some crap coming out of the lymphatic drainage.
So you just put water from your sink in there.
Yeah, and then it's like
Okay.
this little ionizer, and
Okay.
like you look 10 minutes later, and the color is like completely.
Wow.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Makes me want to try that.
Yeah, just a tool. So
Okay.
but these things are stored in our fat tissue, right? So this is why it's
Exactly.
good to lose, maybe fast or at least exercise, mobilize that.
Yeah, I mean, and that's a problem, right? They did a rat study with atrazine. It's one of my favorite studies for people that talk about calories in, calories out, because a lot of scientists have been trained to say, oh, if you eat this many, like weight loss is all about calorie counting, and it's not, because they did two groups of rats, exactly the same calories, and exactly the same everything. That's the nice thing about rats. You know there's no cheating in their diet because you're giving them exactly what they're getting. And one of the groups, they gave low dose atrazine, and they were specific about low dose because they wanted to imitate how much we're getting in our drinking water, and they didn't want to overdose and kill them or anything. That group got fat, and the other group was lean, normal lean rats. And they had the same calories. So obviously, number one, it causes you to gain weight, metabolic dysfunction. Number two, and a lot of that's because estrogen causes weight gain. I mean, if women's estrogen goes from 200 to 2,000, which it does when they're pregnant, they store fat. And they'll tell you like, yeah, I got pregnant and I gained a bunch of baby weight or whatever. And fat is the most efficient storage form for energy. It's way better than sugar, right? Like glycogen, you just burn that up like that. I mean, one sugar molecule, you get about 30 ATPs, 32, 36, debatable. One fat molecule, you get over 100, right? So just in terms of energy storage, fat is super efficient. And then our ancestors didn't always have access to food because they had actual starvation in their real world lives. They had to store a little bit more fat. Now that we don't, so obviously if it's causing you to gain weight, now we've got this like process that's perverting that, where we're getting these fake estrogens and our body thinks that we're pregnant and we're storing extra fat. So it's storing in our fat. It's causing us to gain weight. It's causing all these health problems. Again, the long and short is like, take it seriously. Don't get super hypochondriac about it, I don't think, because you're going to get some. Everybody's getting some exposures, but I think if you just, like eliminate the big hitters like the drinking water, get in the sauna, sweat, and like I said, the personal care products, you're way better off for your health.
Anthony J, this is so important. I really thank you for coming on the show. Definitely check out the book. There'll be linked below. It's on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, anywhere books are sold. An amazing resource. You are an amazing resource. Thank you, as always, for coming on the show. We're here at KetoCon, and this room needs to be used for another seminar. So,
Losing our lights.
man, so grateful to have you on, buddy.
Mike.
I mean, this
Appreciate
is
it.
super amazing. So thanks for watching. Thanks for that like button. Thank you for subscribing. We'll catch you all in a future video down the road.
Well, my friends, that's it for today. As always, thanks for tuning to the very end. Thanks for sharing this video with a friend or family member that you think might be more interested in understanding the ways that their furniture, their clothes, their food, their water, and so forth might be impacting in a negative way their health. I also want to recommend the book Estrogen from Dr. Anthony J. As you can tell, he's an amazing resource and knows this research in and out. He's a great person to follow on the internet and support his work as well. So I'll put all the links in the show notes where you can contact him, check out his books and his research and some other talks that he's given throughout the world and also on the internet at large. So just want to thank you for being here. Thanks for sharing this content and hope you have an awesome rest of your day. We'll catch you all soon. Bye now.